Florida State lands a key defensive end from the transfer portal.
You are Locked On Seminoles, your daily podcast on the Florida State Seminoles. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into Locked On Seminoles. I am your host, Brian Smith, longtime college football recruiting analyst and writer. Thank you for making Locked On Seminoles your first listen each and every day. I truly appreciate you stopping in to talk some Noles with me. Today's show is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. The Noles land Deante McCray, defensive end out of Western Kentucky. The 6'4", 283-pound defensive end is one of those players that Florida State really needed, not just because he's talented, but for several other reasons. We're going to talk about his PFF grades. We're going to talk about his fit. But most importantly, it's just a need because the Noles have lost some defensive ends. You got to replace guys. And that's what we're going to start with. Florida State just lost Patrick Payton, and I know a lot of people aren't high on him, but at least he's very talented. I know they got James Williams coming in, but he's more of that stand-up outside linebacker. McCray is 283 pounds. He fits the strong side, hand in the dirt defensive end position that you need in a 3-3-5 defense. So Tony White, Terrence Pot Roast Knighton, they get another key player up front. So strong side end, outside backer they got. Plus, don't forget, Darrell Jackson Jr. is returning to Florida State instead of going to the draft, which he'd originally announced that he was going to do, was enter the National Football League draft. Florida State's defensive front is way better at this juncture than I thought it would even be after the conclusion of the spring transfer portal. So this is a good start to Florida State's offseason. They haven't made a ton of moves, but the ones they have, especially up front on defense, big thumbs up. So let's talk a little bit about his Pro Football Focus grades. This is a guy that is pretty consistent, to be honest. Looking at his grades overall, I was just viewing them a few minutes ago before I started this podcast, and I'm like, okay, there's consistency here. This isn't just a guy, okay, they're getting an upside guy. He's got the length and all that. His grades show consistency across the board, and I'm going to share my screen now for those of you on YouTube, and those that are not, I will give out all of the numbers. First off, let's talk about the ability to tackle. What was one of the things that myself in particular, I'm not going to lie, complained about a lot during the 24 season for Florida State? Missed tackles, especially in space. Well, it's refreshing. Deante McCray, his tackling grades going from the first game of the year Western Kentucky played against Alabama all the way to Jacksonville State at the end, 74.8 tackling grade against Bama. 60s considered average, by the way. So he's in the mid-70s. He's in the 70s in all but one game for the whole season. That is very rare for a defensive lineman. And again, he's over 280. So he's got to be pretty light on his feet to do that. Right off the bat, you're like, okay, thumbs up. This kid's consistent. He understands technique. He knows what he's doing overall. So you're going to get a veteran that's proven in that regard. Secondarily, when you look at his run defensive grades, he's a 78.5 overall. But again, it's consistency. He didn't have a game you're like, man, this is terrible. He only has one game below 60 the entire season, and that was against Sam Houston State when it was 59.5. So again, consistency is there. His best game, like Toledo, that's a pretty good program in the MAC, 84.6. That's a good sign. When you look at his pass rushing grade, overall it's 62.9, which is just okay. But again, big-bodied D end, I'm not shocked by that. But it go through 50s, 70s, 60s. There's no grade. It's like, oh boy, there could be a problem here. And even against Bama, it's a similar grade than it is against East Kentucky, etc. He's going to bring his lunch pail each and every day. And I know this is boring, but allow me to make a declaration right now. Florida State needs more of a lunch pail mentality. Too many guys last season, whether it was portal or not, that came to the Florida State roster probably didn't have a 100% buy-in to being a Florida State football player. I don't know McCray. I just know the high school he's from. I'll get to that in a second. But being a Jacksonville Sandoval kid, you know, that's also important. I think they're getting a guy that's going to want to be there. He's a North Florida guy. He's proven it at Western Kentucky. If he can put on his full effort, for no offense, but to the Hilltoppers, I think the Seminoles are going to get something. Let's talk about him as a player that, shall we say, is going to help with the defense. Tony White runs the 3-3-5. If you do not have a guy that can two-gap at least occasionally, and they'll do different things within this scheme, I'm quite confident of that based on their history. If you do not have a powerful, strong side end, you know how many times Florida State lost the edge? That's another thing myself and many Florida State fans complained about. Lord only knows based on the comments on the Florida State Locked On Seminoles YouTube page, the quarterback's getting outside. A running back on inside zone bounces it and beats the defense. That shouldn't happen. Florida State had that happen numerous times this past season. It's really important to see that he's a guy that has these great tackling, run defense, consistency, because it's Florida State's biggest Achilles heel is the consistency just in general on both sides of the ball. But up front, they'd get a run stuff. They would get a play that was not just good, it was great. Put a team in 2nd and long, and then it'd be 3rd and 1 because they'd have a run gap bit missed, or they do it right and they'd miss the tackle. It drove me nuts. He had 28 stops on the year for the Hilltoppers. What is a stop per PFF? Pro Football Focus labels it as a play where a guy gets stuffed at or near the line of scrimmage, basically placing the opposition behind the chains. 28 of them is pretty good. He only had 19 pressures, but again, big body guy. He's not there to just be a pass rusher. He's not the twitchy 245-pound guy. He's not Peter Boulware for the mid-90s at Florida State. He's a very athletic player for his size, but going to play the run as much, if not more, than he does the pass. Also, if you look at his missed tackles, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but PFF has him with 1 missed tackle for the season. If you don't want to go by the great, just 1 missed tackle, and that was against, of all teams, Middle Tennessee. I don't know if that's really realistic, but that's crazy. Towards the end of the year, he also turned it up. He had 7 stops in his last 2 games against Liberty and Jacksonville State. He played some of his best football against some of the better teams that he went up against. Finally here, and you can take this any way you want, if you think about why he's a valuable player to Florida State, I mentioned it a moment ago, Florida State needs to get more kids locally. When I was growing up, it was really difficult to get anybody out of the state of Florida that was great away from the Big Three. Sometimes Ohio State did, occasionally Auburn did. Auburn did a pretty good job. Bama would once in a while. Notre Dame definitely got some Florida kids. But by and large, Florida State, and Miami kept kids home. The state has more guys leaving, NIL, etc. It's good to see that FSU is not only getting a quality player at a position of need, a really critical one, honestly, but he's from Sandalwood High School in Jacksonville, Florida. If McCray comes to the Noles, plays really well, even if he's just a 5th or 6th round draft pick, you start to see this is a trend. Farmer's going to the NFL. Jackson should, after this next year, Verse, Fisk, Florida State needs to get back to being a place where it's cool to play defensive line. When I was growing up, there was no doubt. It was a top 5 school every year in D-line recruiting. Every year. They had guys coming off the bench that weren't better than your starter. They were way better than your starter. And by the middle of the 3rd quarter, they smacked you in the mouth. South Georgia kids, Florida kids were the primary players, that they got for those positions. And Florida State's starting to do that again. Getting Wynn out of the high school ranks, getting McCray out of the portal, the same areas that Bowden used to dominate, that's a good sign for Florida State football. So I'm going to leave you on that. They're trending in the right direction with D-line recruiting, no matter which direction they come from. And that is a really important note. Once again, thank you for making Locked On Seminoles your first listen each and every day. I truly appreciate you stopping in to talk some Noles with me. If you have not already, hit that subscription, that like button, and that notification bell. And please share this podcast so I can get in front of more Florida State fans. If you want, you can find me on X at FBScout_Florida. That's FBScout_Florida. Everybody have a good one. I'll talk to you soon.